Elena and Ethan had been married for a year now, and on the surface, their marriage seemed like a dream. Their union was the kind that people admired from afar, a nearly flawless blend of love, stability, and shared goals. Friends often remarked on how well they complemented each other, with Elena's beauty and Ethan's steady presence creating a picture-perfect couple. Elena was the kind of woman who turned heads without trying. Her beauty was understated but undeniable, with soft curves that gave her a graceful silhouette. But it wasn't just her appearance that made her stand out. There was an air of mystery about her, a calm reserve that kept her somewhat apart from the world around her. She wasn't one to indulge in idle chatter or social gatherings, preferring the comfort of her own company or the quiet reassurance of her single close friend. It wasn't that she was antisocial. She just valued her peace, something that had been part of her upbringing as the cherished only daughter of a wealthy family. Her father had doted on her, seeing in Elena a reflection of his own ambitions and dreams. When she married Ethan, it was as if the final chapter of a carefully written story had been completed. The wedding was nothing short of grand, lavish decorations, a guest list that read like a who's who of the community, and a celebration that lingered in the minds of the attendees long after the day had passed. The marriage was seen as a perfect match. Elena, the beautiful daughter of a prosperous family, and Ethan, the self-made man whose hard work had pulled him from the depths of poverty into a position of respect. Ethan's journey had been anything but easy. As the firstborn in his family, which struggled to make ends meet, he had taken on responsibilities that weighed heavily on his young shoulders. Dropping out of school wasn't a choice he made lightly, but a necessity. His parents, though loving, simply didn't have the means to support the education of 3 children. Ethan's sacrifice allowed his younger brothers to continue their studies, and he threw himself into work with a determination that knew no bounds. He took on any job he could find, often working long hours for meager pay, but each job was a stepping stone, a way to climb out of the abyss of poverty. Years later, his hard work bore fruit. Ethan returned home a success, a man who had not only lifted himself, but had also laid the foundation for a better life for his family. It was this strength and unrelenting spirit that had drawn Elena to him. They had dated for a time, their relationship built on mutual respect and a deep, abiding affection. When Ethan asked for her hand in marriage, it was as if all the hardship he had faced was validated by this moment of happiness. The early days of their marriage were filled with hope and contentment. Ethan was a loving husband, always making sure that Elena had everything she needed. He worked tirelessly, running his business with the same determination that had pulled him out of poverty. For Elena, this was the life she had always wanted, a stable, loving marriage with a man she could respect and rely on. Yet Ethan, for all his virtues, was not the lover she had imagined he would be. Their intimate moments were brief and lacked the depth of connection she had always dreamed of. He was what people called the one-minute man. She had waited and preserved her virginity for the passion she believed would come with marriage, but it never did. Elena tried to ignore the disappointment at first. She reminded herself of all the good things in her life, the love, the stability, the respect. But as time went on, the void only grew larger. She had spoken to Ethan about it, hoping he would understand her needs, but his response was always the same, a dismissive remark that left her feeling more alone than before. "It's not food," Ethan would say with a slight frown, his voice tinged with impatience. There are more important things to worry about. For Ethan, sex was a simple act, something to be done and moved past. He didn't see it as the deep bonding experience that Elena longed for. And so, night after night, she lay in their bed, her thoughts swirling with unfulfilled desires and a growing fear that this was all they would ever be. Despite her dissatisfaction, Elena tried to focus on the positives. She loved Ethan. She really did. He was a good man, a provider, someone who had overcome so much to build a life for them. But the dreams she had once nurtured, the dreams of a passionate, all-consuming love, began to feel like distant fantasies, slowly slipping through her fingers. And yet she kept them to herself, hiding the depth of her longing, the sense of incompleteness that haunted her soul. After all, what could she say? That she was unhappy with a man who had given her everything, That she wanted more from him than he was capable of giving? The evening had started like any other. The day's routine had unfolded without incident. And now, as darkness settled over the city, Elena and Ethan were winding down for the night. Dinner was simple and uneventful. The conversation sparse as Ethan was preoccupied with work and Elena's thoughts were elsewhere. After cleaning up, they retired to the living room. Ethan flicked on the television while Elena absent-mindedly flipped through a magazine. But beneath the surface of their calm routine, something felt off. Elena couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her, a feeling she couldn't quite put into words. It was a heaviness in the air, an unspoken tension that made the silence between them feel almost oppressive. As the evening wore on, they decided to call it a night. Ethan went ahead to the bedroom while Elena lingered in the living room, lost in her thoughts. It was only when she heard the distant sound of a car pulling up outside that she finally got up to join her husband. But just as she was about to turn off the light, a loud crash shattered the stillness of the night. Elena's heart leaped into her throat. She froze, straining to listen, her mind racing. Had she imagined it? But then she heard it again, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps approaching fast. "Ethan," she whispered urgently, rushing to the bedroom. "Ethan, something is wrong." Ethan, half asleep, grudgingly sat up, confusion written on his face. "What is it?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. Before Elena could answer, the door to their bedroom burst open and 3 masked men stormed in, guns drawn. Elena's scream caught in her throat as one of the men pointed a gun directly at Ethan, who immediately raised his hands and surrendered. "Don't move," the man growled, his voice cold and threatening. Elena felt her legs buckle beneath her as fear washed over her in waves. She clutched the edge of the bed, her mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not to them. The men wasted no time. 2 of them began ransacking the room, searching for valuables, while the third one, holding the gun, kept a close eye on Elena and Ethan. Ethan's voice, trembling, pleaded with them. "Please, take whatever you want. Just don't hurt us." The man with the gun sneered. "We'll take what we want. But that's not all we are here for." Elena's blood ran cold at the implication behind his words. She clung to Ethan, her fear mounting as the men continued to tear through their belongings, tossing drawers open, pulling down shelves, and emptying closets. The chaos. Finally, one of the men found what he was looking for, a small safe hidden at the back of the closet. He yanked it out and threw it on the bed, glaring at Ethan. "Open it." Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting to Elena, who was trembling beside him. The man with the gun stepped closer, his finger twitching on the trigger. "Open it, now." With shaking hands, Ethan obeyed, entering the code and opening the safe. The man snatched the cash and jewelry inside, stuffing them into a bag. But as he did, he exchanged a glance with the man holding the gun, and a silent understanding passed between them. The man with the gun turned his attention to Elena, his eyes narrowing as he took in her terrified expression. A slow, sinister smile spread across his face. "Get over here," he ordered, gesturing for her to stand up. Elena shook her head, her heart pounding. "Please, please don't," she whispered, backing away. Ethan's voice rose in panic. "Please, don't hurt her. Take everything. Just don't touch her." But the man ignored him. He reached out and grabbed Elena's arm, dragging her to her feet with a roughness that made her cry out in pain. Ethan tried to move toward her, but the other 2 men held him back, forcing him to watch. The man with the gun pushed Elena onto the bed, his grin widening as he leaned in close, his breath hot against her face. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the horror of what was about to happen. But there was no escape. The reality of the situation hit her with full force. She was completely at their mercy, and Ethan was powerless to stop it. Ethan struggled against his captors, his eyes wide with desperation and fear. "No. Please. No," he cried, his voice breaking. But the men holding him only tightened their grip, forcing him to watch as the unthinkable happened. Elena felt the tears streaming down her face, her body trembling with fear and shame as the man violated her. Worse still was the fact that her body began to respond in ways she never imagined. As he forced himself on her in a way Ethan never had, She found herself fighting against unwanted physical pleasure. She tried to control herself, but her body betrayed her, and her moaning made even Ethan wonder what exactly was going on. Every second felt like an eternity, each moment searing itself into her memory. She could hear Ethan's anguished cries, feel his helplessness, but there was nothing either of them could do. Ethan had never heard his wife moan like that, and he prayed that this nightmare would end. Finally, it was over. The man stepped back, satisfied, and Elena curled into herself, sobbing uncontrollably as the horror of what had happened sank in. The other men released Ethan, who stood frozen for a moment before it truly hit him. He immediately rushed to her side, but the damage was done. The room was filled with a heavy silence, the only sound Elena's broken sobs. The man with the gun gave Ethan one last look, his expression a mix of satisfaction and contempt. "Remember this," he warned coldly. "If you ever cross us again, it'll be worse." And with that, the men left, disappearing into the night as quickly as they had come. Ethan held Elena tightly, his own tears falling as he whispered over and over, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." But no words could undo what had happened. The violation had shattered something deep inside Elena, something that would never be the same again. And as Ethan held her, both of them knew that their lives had been irrevocably changed. The days following the attack were a blur for Elena. She moved through her life in a daze, the events of that horrific night replaying over and over in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't escape. The house, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt like a prison, each room a reminder of the violation she had endured. Ethan was beside himself with guilt, anger, and shame. He couldn't look at Elena the same way without remembering how she had, at least physically, responded to the assault. He kept seeing the pain etched into her face. Or was it the guilt of having felt something during the attack? He blamed himself for not being able to protect her, for failing in his role as her husband. He wanted to comfort her, to hold her and tell her everything would be all right. But every time he tried, he could see her flinch as though his touch was too much to bear. He was going crazy. The police were called, of course. They took their statements and asked their questions, but Elena could hardly bring herself to speak. She answered in short, clipped sentences, her voice devoid of emotion, her eyes fixed on some distant point. Ethan did most of the talking, his voice thick with barely suppressed rage. But deep down, he knew that no amount of police work could erase what had been done. Elena's family came to visit, their faces drawn with shock and sorrow. Her father, once so strong and composed, looked like a broken man as he took her hands in his voice trembling as he tried to offer words of comfort. But Elena could hardly hear him. She was trapped in her own world, a world where the shadows of that night loomed large and inescapable. Ethan's family came as well, their concern palpable. But their presence only served to deepen the tension. Brandon, Ethan's younger brother, was particularly attentive, always asking if there was anything he could do, if Elena needed anything. But every time he came close, Elena felt a shiver of unease. There was something about the way he looked at her, a gaze that lingered just a moment too long, that made her skin crawl. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind his concern, something darker she couldn't quite place. As days turned into weeks, the distance between Elena and Ethan grew wider. Ethan tried to be there for her, but the weight of what had happened was too much for him to bear. He began to retreat, spending more time at work, avoiding Elena whenever he could. When they did speak, it was stilted and awkward, the easy companionship they once shared now a distant memory. Elena, too, withdrew into herself. She spent hours in their bedroom, the curtains drawn, the world outside forgotten. She couldn't bring herself to face anyone, not even Ethan. The pain, the shame, the overwhelming sense of loss. It was all too much. She felt like a ghost in her own life, drifting through the days without purpose or direction. Then one morning, as she was getting dressed, Elena felt a strange wave of nausea wash over her. It came out of nowhere, sudden and intense, leaving her lightheaded and weak. She rushed to the bathroom, barely making it to the sink before she was sick. As she rinsed her mouth, she felt a growing sense of dread. This was more than just stress, more than the lingering effect of that awful night. Something was wrong. She didn't say anything to Ethan at first. She couldn't bear to worry him. Not when he was already so distant and closed off. But as the days passed and the nausea returned, she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She made an appointment with the doctor, telling herself that it was probably nothing, just a reaction to the trauma. But when the doctor came back with the results, Elena felt her world tilt on its axis. She was pregnant. The news hit her like a punch to the gut. She sat in the doctor's office in numb shock, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. Pregnant? How could this be happening? How could she be carrying a child after everything she'd been through? She barely remembered the rest of the appointment. The doctor's words faded into a dull hum, her mind fixated on one terrifying thought. This baby, this life growing inside her, was a constant reminder of that night, a living, breathing connection to the horror she wanted so desperately to forget. When she told Ethan, the look on his face broke her heart all over again. He stared at her in stunned silence, his expression a mixture of disbelief and devastation. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the news hanging heavy in the air between them. How far along? He finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. About 6 weeks, Elena replied, her own voice trembling. She couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes, couldn't bear to see the pain she knew was there. Ethan stood up abruptly, running a hand through his hair as he began to pace the room. I don't know what to say, he stammered, his thoughts barely coherent. How are we supposed to deal with this? Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Neither do I, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know what to do, Ethan. I don't know how to feel. Ethan stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression one of utter despair. How can we keep it, Elena? How can we bring a child into the world under these circumstances? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Elena had asked herself the same thing 100 times since leaving the doctor's office, but she had no answer. All she knew was that every decision felt wrong, every option a path to deeper pain. Over the next few days, the news of Elena's pregnancy spread through the family, adding another layer of tension to an already strained situation. Family meetings became more frequent, with voices raised in anger and sorrow, each person offering their own opinion on what should be done. Some insisted that Elena should terminate the pregnancy, believing it was the only way to move on from the horror of that night. Others argued that she should keep the baby, that it wasn't the child's fault, and that, in time, the family could heal. But no one had an easy answer. The uncertainty, the fear, the overwhelming sense of loss, it all weighed heavily on Elena, pushing her closer and closer to the edge. And through it all, Ethan remained distant, avoiding Elena as much as possible. He didn't speak to her unless it was absolutely necessary, didn't touch her, didn't look at her the way he used to. The chasm between them, already wide, seemed to grow by the day, and Elena felt more alone than ever. In the quiet of the night, when the house was dark and still, Elena would lie awake, her mind racing with the impossible choices before her. She wondered if she would ever feel whole again, if she could ever look at herself without seeing the scars left by that night. And most of all, she wondered if her marriage, once so strong, could survive this storm, or if it was already too late. The days dragged on, filled with a suffocating tension that wrapped itself around Elena and Ethan like a shroud. The weight of the pregnancy and the unresolved trauma hung over them both, casting a shadow that neither could escape. Ethan continued to retreat, spending long hours at work to avoid Elena altogether. When he was home, the love and warmth that had once defined their marriage seemed to have evaporated, leaving behind only a cold, unbearable silence. For her part, Elena found herself sinking into despair. The nausea had become a constant companion, a reminder of the life growing inside of her. She didn't know how to feel about it. She couldn't bring herself to make a decision, trapped in an endless cycle of guilt, shame, and fear. Every option seemed wrong, every path filled with pain. It was during one of those bleak days that Brandon paid another visit. He had been coming by more often, offering to help with errands, bringing food, trying to lighten the burden Elena was carrying. At first, Elena had been grateful for his support, seeing it as an extension of the family bond, that had always held them together. But lately, something about Brandon's presence had begun to unsettle her. There was a look in his eyes, a lingering gaze, that made Elena uncomfortable. He was too attentive, too eager to be close to her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more behind his concern. She tried to push this thought aside, telling herself she was being paranoid, that her mind was playing tricks on her after everything she had been through. But the unease remained, nagging at her like a persistent shadow. One afternoon, when Ethan was at work, Brandon arrived unannounced. Elena was in the kitchen, trying to keep herself busy, when she heard the doorbell. She wiped her hands on a towel and went to answer it, forcing a smile as she opened the door. "Brandon," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What brings you here today?" Brandon smiled back, but there was something in his eyes that made Elena's skin prickle. "Just checking in on you," he said smoothly. "I know things have been hard lately. I thought you might need some company." Elena hesitated, but then stepped aside to let him in. "Thank you. That's kind of you." They sat in the living room, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken tension. Brandon asked how she was feeling, whether there was anything she needed. But Elena could barely focus on his words. Her mind kept drifting back to that nagging feeling that something was off, that there was more to his visit than met the eye. As the conversation dragged on, Brandon's tone became more personal, more intimate. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low murmur, and Elena felt her pulse quicken with unease. "You know, Elena," he said, his eyes locked on hers, "you don't have to go through this alone. I'm here for you, you know that. I want to help you in any way I can." Elena forced a smile, but inside, her nerves were on edge. "Thank you, Brandon," she replied, her voice tight. "But I'm managing." He reached out his hand, brushing against hers. Elena recoiled instinctively, pulling her hand back. Brandon's smile faltered for a moment, his eyes darkening. But then he quickly recovered, laughing it off as if it were nothing. "You know you can trust me, right?" he said, his voice almost too smooth. "We've always looked out for each other." Elena nodded, but her mind was racing. She needed to get him out of the house, away from her. The feeling of dread that had been simmering under the surface was now a full-blown alarm, and she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. "I appreciate that, Brandon," she said, standing up abruptly. "But I'm really tired today. I think I need to rest." Brandon's expression flickered with something she couldn't quite identify. Disappointment, frustration. But he stood up as well, nodding. "Of course," he said, his smile friendly again. "I'll let you rest. But remember, Elena, I'm always here if you need me." As soon as the door closed behind him, Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed by a surge of anxiety. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know what to do about it. She felt trapped, isolated, and completely alone.